"Get off me! I will kill you! I will kill every single one of you!" Sterling Vane's voice did not sound like a chief executive officer anymore. It sounded like a cornered animal being dragged to the slaughter. A heavy, gray sensory deprivation hood was jerked over his head, silencing his frantic screams into muffled, wet grunts. The two massive guards did not show mercy. They gripped his arms and dragged his expensive $4,000 suit across the obsidian floor, leaving long, ugly white scuffs on the polished surface. "Your credit score is now 0. The mechanical voice of the Federal Bioethics and Estate Agency auditor echoed through the silent ballroom. "All professional licenses permanently revoked. Personal assets seized for liquidation." 10 minutes earlier, Sterling Vane thought he was a god. The annual investor dinner for the Eternal Archive was supposed to be his coronation. The room was set to a lethal 4 degrees Celsius. Sterling stood on the obsidian stage in an ice-blue, ultra-slim suit that radiated a sense of absolute, frozen efficiency. Beside him stood Caleb, the senior succession counsel. Caleb wore a single black silk glove on his left hand and held an 18th-century brass stopwatch. While Sterling calculated the profits of the afterlife, Caleb calculated the milliseconds of a human life. "Look at him," Sterling had sneered into the microphone, his voice amplified to a sharp, predatory purr. "The human logic gate," Caleb here represents the bureaucratic rot that we are cutting out tonight. He insists on a 300-hour cooling period for our deceased clients. He thinks a pocket watch can stop a $1 trillion IPO. The crowd of billionaires laughed. It was a cold, expensive sound that filled the freezing air. "As of right now," Sterling announced, flicking his fingers with theatrical flair, "I am exercising my emergency administrative override. According to Section 9, Clause 4 of the Employee Handbook, my mandate is to maximize asset velocity. We are bypassing the manual audits. We are moving from human-verified succession to automated asset liquidation immediately. We aren't waiting for the law to catch up to our technology. We are the law." Caleb did not flinch. He did not beg for his job. He simply looked down at his stopwatch. 000345. "Mr. Vane," Caleb said, his voice flat and rhythmic, matching the mechanical tick in his hand, "I must formally advise you that bypassing the cooling period is an irreversible action. The system is currently overriding the legal continuity files. If you hit that button, the federal definition of these assets changes from persons to unclaimed property. You are crossing a line that cannot be uncrossed." "Exactly," Sterling barked, his eyes gleaming under the purple HUD lights of the stage. "An unclaimed property does not have rights. It does not have heirs. It belongs to the archive. Thank you, Caleb, for proving how useless you are. You're a footnote in my success story. Now, step aside, or I will have security drag you out for gross insubordination under Section 12. Choose, now." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted keycard. He held it up for the cameras, for the investors, and for the silent, gray-suited figures standing in the shadows at the back of the room. "By your command, Mr. Vane," Caleb said softly. "The gate is now open. The system is yours." Sterling grabbed the tablet from his minion. He did not just tap the screen, he slammed his finger onto the confirm button with a manic grin. "Under the Executive Prerogative Clause of the 2026 Charter, I, Sterling Vane, authorize the total bypass of all manual ethical audits. Finalize the harvest." The ballroom shifted, the deep blue holographic souls floating in the air turned a jagged, bleeding red. A low-frequency hum vibrated in the floorboards, rattling the champagne glasses of the billionaires in the front row. The harvest had begun, and Sterling Vane was finally in control, or so he thought. The red light of the server display reflected off Sterling's teeth as he laughed. He walked a slow, mocking circle around Caleb, his ice-blue suit shimmering like a glacier. The cooling fans in the ballroom surged to a deafening roar, a mechanical gale that whipped at Caleb's black silk glove. To the investors, it was the sound of progress. To Caleb, it was the sound of 1,000 legal personas being digitally lobotomized. "Do you hear that, Caleb?" Sterling shouted over the hum of the servers. "That is the sound of your obsolescence. While you were busy polishing your antique watch and worrying about soul integrity, I just generated more revenue in 60 seconds than you have in 20 years of service. You aren't a senior counsel anymore. You are a speed bump on the road to our IPO." Sterling stopped in front of Caleb and reached out, flicking the brass stopwatch with a contemptuous finger. "This is your problem. You think time matters. You think people matter. But in this room, only data survives. Look at the HUD, Caleb. 100% of the manual gates are down. Your entire department is now redundant. Redundant. Do you even know what that means? It means you are a ghost in my machine." One of Sterling's minions, the head of liquidations, stepped forward. He adjusted his own razor-thin tie and smirked at Caleb. The interim CEO is right. Caleb, we checked the legal archives. Your role was created for an era that just ended. You are a janitor guarding a graveyard that we just turned into a gold mine. Maybe you can use that black glove to wipe the dust off the server racks after we fire you. The crowd erupted in another wave of cruel laughter. Caleb stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't defend his career. He didn't plead for his pension. He simply looked at the stopwatch. 0005:12. I must remind you once more, Mr. Vane, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a cold blade. The system is currently recording every millisecond of this bypass. According to the Federal Bioasset Protection Act, you are personally liable for— I am liable for nothing, Sterling interrupted, his voice rising to a manic pitch. I am the one who signs the checks. I am the one the investors trust. You are a support staff relic who is about to be escorted out of the building. Your clearance is already being revoked as we speak. Sterling turned to the audience, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace the red glow of the server racks. Ladies and gentlemen, watch the screen. As the harvest hits the halfway mark, the archive's valuation has just tripled. We are no longer a storage facility. We are a digital bank. And the best part, we didn't need a single lawyer to do it. Sterling turned back to Caleb, his eyes narrowing. You're done. Your keycard is dead. Your office is being cleared out by a drone. And that watch? I think I'll take that as a souvenir of the day I killed the human logic gate. Sterling reached for the stopwatch, his hand moving with the confidence of a man who owned the world. Caleb didn't move. He didn't pull away. He let Sterling's fingers brush the cold brass of the 18th century device. The harvest is at 49%, Mr. Vane, Caleb whispered, his breath visible in the 4-degree air. Once it hits 50, the automated reporting protocol triggers. There is no manual override for what happens next, not even for a chief executive officer. There is always an override for me, Sterling screamed, his face turning a dark, ugly purple. Security! Why is this man still standing on my stage? Drag him out. Take him to the loading docks and throw him into the street. He is trespassing on private property. The two tactical guards stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the obsidian. They grabbed Caleb by the shoulders. The investors leaned forward, their faces twisted with a dark, voyeuristic hunger. They wanted to see the old guard broken. They wanted to see the professional counselor humiliated in front of the world. As the guards began to pull Caleb away, he didn't struggle. He simply looked at his stopwatch one last time and clicked the side button. Tick. 5 seconds to 50%, Sterling, Caleb said softly. I hope your ice blue suit is as cold as you think it is, because the air in here is about to get very, very thin. Sterling just laughed. A jagged, arrogant sound that filled the room. He didn't see the gray-suited auditors in the back of the room finally opening their tablets. He didn't see his head of liquidations suddenly go pale as his own device began to flash with a crimson warning light. Sterling was too busy celebrating his victory over a man he thought was already defeated. The server room hummed with a low, bone-shaking frequency as the progress bar on the wall-sized HUD hit 50%. The violet light of the ballroom suddenly snapped into a harsh, strobe-like crimson. A siren, tuned to the exact frequency of human panic, wailed once and then fell into a rhythmic, pulsing thud. What is that? Marcus, fix the display, Sterling shouted, his voice cracking. Caleb planted his feet, stopping the two guards with a sudden, immovable strength. He held up his brass stopwatch. The face was no longer showing time. It was flashing a gold federal seal. That is the sound of a capital felony being logged in real time. Sterling, Caleb said, his voice cutting through the siren. At 50%, the system is no longer performing a corporate liquidation. It has just crossed the threshold into mass digital homicide. This stopwatch is a hardware-encrypted BEA Sentinel key. It has mirrored every single command you just issued directly to the federal cloud. Sterling froze for a second, his eyes darting to the investors. Then, the dead cat bounce hit. He threw his head back and let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. A Sentinel key? You really are a dinosaur, Caleb. Sterling sneered, stepping forward to bridge the gap between them. That evidence is inadmissible. Section 22 of the Privacy Act prohibits unauthorized mirroring of corporate data. You just committed a crime to catch a ghost. Security, stop standing there. Drag this traitor out and smash that device. The guards hesitated, looking from the screaming CEO to the calm man with the black silk glove. I have executive immunity, Sterling screamed, spit flying from his lips. I am the interim CEO. I signed the waivers. I am the law in this building. Marcus, tell the auditors this is a planned stress test. Tell them now. Marcus, the head of liquidations, did not move. He was staring at his tablet, his face the color of damp ash. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. Marcus, Sterling barked. Do your job. I can't, Sterling, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. The BEA just locked my admin credentials. They didn't just see the harvest. They saw the shadow ledger. They saw the offshore accounts you opened in my name to hide the soul-skimming profits. Sterling's face went from purple to a ghostly, translucent white. You're lying. You're part of this. I'm not going to jail for you, Sterling, Marcus said, his voice gaining a desperate strength. He turned the tablet around so the entire room could see the scrolling logs of illegal transfers. He forced us to bypass the cooling periods for the ultra-high net worth accounts first. He wanted the commissions before the IPO. It's all here. Every command, every override, every murder. The two gray-suited BEA auditors stepped out of the shadows. They did not run, they walked with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a funeral procession. Their life support packs hissed in the cold air. One auditor raised a hand, and a localized electromagnetic pulse killed every screen in the room except for the one displaying Sterling's crimes. Sterling Vane. The mechanical voice of the auditor boomed through the hall. Pursuant to the Bio-Asset Protection Act and the Fiduciary Duty Amendment, this facility is now under federal seizure. Your administrative override is void. Your executive immunity is revoked for premeditated malice. You can't do this, Sterling shrieked, his rules lawyer persona flailing for a final loophole. I have a limited liability shield. Section 4 of the corporate charter protects me from personal seizure. Section 4, subsection B. The auditor droned. Liability shields are void in cases of biological personhood termination. You are no longer an officer of this company. You are a Category 1 felon in the middle of a crime scene. The investors, sensing the ship was not just sinking but exploding, scrambled for the exits. Their expensive silks rustled like dry leaves as they fled the light of the BEA tablets. Caleb looked at his stopwatch. 00:08:45. He looked at Sterling, who was now backed against the edge of the stage, trapped between the auditors and the red glow of the servers he had tried to steal. The harvest is stopped, Sterling, Caleb said softly. The clients are safe, but you just ran out of time. The red strobe lights, pulsing against the black walls, seemed to sync with the frantic beating of Sterling Vane's heart. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, save for the mechanical hiss of the BEA auditors. The rules lawyer was dead. There were no more clauses to hide behind. No more handbooks to weaponize. Then, the Mad King arrived. No, Sterling's voice tore through the air, a raw, jagged sound that had no humanity left in it. He didn't just scream, he howled. He lunged at Caleb, his fingers clawing like talons, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I built this. I am the architect of immortality. You are just a parasite in a black glove. I will erase you. I will burn this entire facility to the ground before I let you take it. Caleb took one calm step back. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. He didn't need to. The two massive guards, who had been waiting for the final signal, intercepted Sterling mid-air. They slammed the former chief executive officer onto the obsidian floor with a bone-jarring thud. Get off me, Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, animalistic squeal. He began to thrash on the floor, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the polished stone, leaving long, ugly white streaks. He bit the arm of one guard, drawing blood, his eyes rolling back in his head until only the whites were visible. I am a god. You can't arrest a god. Marcus, kill them. Kill them all. The investors who hadn't escaped yet watched in horror as the man who had promised them eternal life dissolved into a rabid beast. Marcus did not move. He simply looked down at Sterling with a mixture of pity and cold disgust. The lead BEA auditor stepped forward and placed a small humming beacon on the floor next to Sterling's head. Asset nullification. Finalized, the mechanical voice announced, Sterling Vane, identity deleted from all federal registries. Financial status, total 0. Reclassification, biological waste, identity deleted. Sterling gasped, his rage suddenly flickering into a moment of pure, crystalline terror. No, you can't delete me. I have the codes. I am the data. You are nothing but noise, Sterling, Caleb said, standing over the broken man, and the system just performed a cleanup. The guards didn't bother with handcuffs. They grabbed Sterling by his ice-blue lapels and began to drag him toward the back of the stage. Sterling continued to scream, but the sounds were becoming less like words and more like the static of a dying radio. He clawed at the floor, his fingernails breaking against the obsidian, leaving bloody marks as he was hauled toward the service elevator. "Caleb, wait!" Sterling's muffled voice echoed from the hallway, desperate and cracking. "I can give you the secret files, the $500 billion accounts. Just tell them it was a glitch. Caleb, answer me." Caleb did not answer. He didn't even look toward the sound of the elevator doors sliding shut, cutting off the last of the Mad King's screams. The ballroom was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. The red lights died, replaced by the soft, steady blue glow of the souls Caleb had saved. Caleb reached up with his black silk glove and clicked the brass stopwatch for the final time. Stop. The ticking ceased. The 18th century device felt heavy and solid in his palm, a piece of real history in a world of fake immortals. He didn't look at the auditors. He didn't look at the weeping minions or the empty champagne glasses. Caleb simply turned his back on the stage and the archive. He walked through the massive obsidian doors, his footsteps echoing with a steady, lonely rhythm. Outside, the night air was 4 degrees, but for the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel the chill. He walked toward his car, leaving the billion-dollar crime scene behind him. Behind the closed doors, the BEA was already dismantling Sterling's empire, but Caleb was already gone. He had a watch to wind, and the silence of the night was the only reward he needed.
There's something undeniably poetic about watching a man who tried to liquidate human souls end up being reclassified as biological waste himself. If you held the keys to a system that could technically make you a billionaire overnight, would you remain a silent observer like Caleb, or would that confirm button be too tempting for you to ignore? Just between us, the ticking in the background isn't a stock sound. I actually recorded a 1780s pocket watch to make sure Sterling's countdown to professional extinction felt as heavy as possible.